When I bought my house, I imagined a peaceful life. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawns were trimmed, and most of the residents seemed to take pride in keeping things clean and orderly. What drew me in most, however, was the yard. It was large enough to build something meaningful, a small vegetable garden I had dreamed of for years. To me, it wasn't just about fresh tomatoes and herbs. It was about building something sustainable, something that gave me purpose and reminded me of my grandparents, who had always worked with their hands in the soil. Within weeks of moving in, I began digging out a corner of the yard, placing neat wooden beds and filling them with rich soil. I planted tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, bell peppers, lettuce, and herbs that sprouted with fragrant promise. Every morning before work, I would check on the plants, water them, and feel a deep sense of pride as tiny green shoots began to break the surface. It was a simple joy that made the house feel truly like home. But it wasn't long before trouble arrived. Across the street lived a woman everyone in the neighborhood already warned me about, Karen. She had the kind of reputation that traveled faster than gossip at a family reunion. Complaints about cars parked too close to the curb, letters to the HOA about holiday decorations, even petty arguments over lawn ornaments. She thrived on control, and from the way she eyed my garden every time she drove by, I knew it was only a matter of time before I ended up on her list. Sure enough, one warm Saturday morning, as I knelt down to trim some weeds, I caught her standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at my garden as though I had dumped trash across the entire neighborhood. She didn't say anything, but the disapproving look said more than enough. The following week, I received a letter from the HOA. At first, I thought it might be a welcome package or a reminder about upcoming neighborhood events. But as I unfolded the letter, my stomach sank. It was a notice of violation. According to the HOA, my vegetable garden violated the aesthetic harmony of the community. They demanded that I remove it immediately or face escalating fines, starting at $100 a day. The words barely made sense to me. A vegetable garden? Ugly? It was neat, well-maintained, and healthier than half the patchy lawns I had seen walking around the neighborhood. I knew instantly who had filed the complaint. Karen. She didn't even need to sign her name. Her fingerprints were all over it. At first I felt anger, hot and sharp, but that soon gave way to determination. I wasn't about to let someone like her dictate how I lived on my own property, especially when what I was doing was not only harmless, but beneficial. I began combing through the HOA's official documents, searching for any line that mentioned gardens. Hours of reading revealed something important. While the HOA had guidelines about front-facing landscaping, there was nothing that explicitly banned backyard gardens, especially when kept within certain boundaries. Armed with this knowledge, I wrote an appeal to the HOA, detailing how my garden was legal and well-maintained. I attached photos of its neat layout, the way the beds were bordered by wood, and how nothing extended beyond the property line. I even cited examples from neighboring communities that encouraged sustainable gardening as a positive, eco-friendly feature. Days passed with no response. I continued tending to my plants, though every time Karen drove by, she slowed her car and glared. It became a ritual, me watering the lettuce, her passing slowly, eyes narrowing like I was committing some unspeakable crime. Finally, a letter arrived from the HOA. I tore it open, hoping they had seen reason. Instead, my blood boiled. The HOA claimed my garden disrupted the visual consistency of the community and gave me a 14-day ultimatum to remove it or face daily fines. It was absurd, and I knew Karen had pressed them harder behind the scenes. I wasn't ready to give in. The garden had become more than plants. It was a symbol of standing my ground. So I prepared for a fight. I started by documenting everything, photos of my garden, every letter from the HOA, even logs of Karen's constant drive-by surveillance. I reached out to local gardening groups online, who assured me that my situation was not only unfair but potentially illegal. Some even suggested that HOA boards could not enforce rules that weren't explicitly written in their bylaws. At the same time, I began noticing something odd about Karen's yard. Her landscaping wasn't nearly as perfect as she pretended. While her front lawn was meticulously green, her side yard contained something questionable. A row of non-native plants that seemed invasive, spreading aggressively into the neighbor's fence line. I remembered reading somewhere in the HOA handbook that invasive species were strictly forbidden. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Karen, calling my garden ugly and demanding it be torn out, while her own yard contained a direct violation of HOA rules. For the first time since this battle began, I felt a small flicker of hope. But I knew I had to be careful. The HOA board wasn't exactly friendly. They were already siding with Karen. If I wanted to turn the tide, I needed undeniable proof, something they couldn't ignore. That night, as I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker, I realized this wasn't just about vegetables or flowers. This was about power, about one neighbor's obsession with control, and an HOA too eager to play along. What Karen didn't know, though, was that her own hypocrisy was about to become her downfall. The days following the HOA's ultimatum felt heavy, like a storm creeping closer on the horizon. My garden had once been a source of peace, but now every tomato sprout and cucumber vine seemed like a countdown clock. 14 days. 14 days before the fines would begin, before the HOA would try to strong-arm me into submission. I refused to tear it out. The garden had become more than a patch of vegetables. It was a stand against absurdity, against neighbors like Karen who thrived on intimidation. But refusing meant preparing for battle, and I quickly realized I couldn't fight this war on instinct alone. The first step was research. I dug deeper into the HOA bylaws, rereading every clause with a fine-tooth comb. I highlighted the sections on landscaping, aesthetic harmony, and community uniformity. Nowhere, not once, did the rules mention private gardens in backyards. The only specific regulation concerned front-facing plant modifications visible from the street, and mine, perfectly tucked away behind the fence line. I made copies, highlighted the relevant sections, and began assembling what looked more and more like a legal case file. But paperwork wasn't enough. HOAs, I quickly learned, were not always logical. They thrived on perception, on appearances, on siding with the loudest voice in the room. And right now, Karen was that voice. She had lived in the neighborhood for years. She knew the board members personally, and judging by how fast they moved against me, she had their ears wrapped tightly around her finger. So I decided to change the narrative. If Karen wanted the board to see me as a nuisance, I'd make sure they saw the truth about her instead. I began documenting her yard more closely. At first it felt invasive, but then I reminded myself she was the one who weaponized rules against me. All I was doing was holding her to the same standard. Early one morning, I took photos of the invasive plants crawling along her fence line. They weren't just creeping into her neighbor's yard. They were also strangling sections of the community-maintained green strip. HOA rules specifically listed invasive species as forbidden landscaping. This wasn't just petty, it was damaging to the neighborhood's ecosystem. The more I looked, the more I found. Karen had placed a row of decorative lights along her front walkway that exceeded the approved wattage. A clause in the handbook clearly limited outdoor lighting to subtle, warm tones that do not spill beyond property lines. Karen's lights? They glared like airport runway signals, bleeding into the street at night. Another violation. And then came the jackpot. On the far side of her property, hidden behind a row of hedges, sat an unapproved shed. The HOA rules required all exterior structures to be pre-approved by the board, down to the exact paint color and roof material. Karen's shed was mismatched, slapped together like an afterthought, and clearly not authorized. If the HOA wanted consistency, this was a blatant eyesore. I organized everything into a neat folder: photos, dates, cross-referenced bylaws. It wasn't enough just to accuse, I needed undeniable evidence. And now I had it. But I didn't strike immediately. Instead, I watched and waited. Karen's campaign against me grew louder. She made a point of walking past my house every evening, staring at my garden as though cataloging new complaints. I overheard her one day talking to another neighbor about the eyesore down the block. The more she pushed, the more reckless she became, confident that the HOA had her back. Meanwhile, the board sent me another letter. This time, the tone was sharper. They acknowledged my appeal but dismissed it, claiming that community standards are ultimately subject to board interpretation. In other words, they could make the rules up as they went along. They warned me again: remove the garden or face financial penalties. That night, frustration nearly broke me. I sat in my living room, staring at the stack of letters, wondering if it was worth it. Was I really going to wage war over a garden? Wouldn't it be easier to just tear it out, plant grass, and avoid the stress?